Everybody who's obese does that. It's actually a minority of people. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. It's a useful way of distinguishing the three eating disorders that we recognize. So anorexia nervosa, by definition, is underweight, and some people are underweight to an extreme degree. Bulimics, people with bulimia nervosa tend to be normal weight. Anorexia nervosa, when you're underweight, you can have the restricting subtype or the binge purge subtype. So bulimic behavior does occur in anorexia nervosa, about 50% of people with anorexia, but those people are at a low weight by definition. People with normal weight bulimia nervosa never lose a lot of weight, and generally speaking, rarely are overweight or obese. Binge definition, not compensating. Okay? People with bulimia nervosa compensate for their binge eating. They're consuming huge amounts of calories, and they do something to get rid of the calories. They vomit, they take laxatives, they take diuretics, sometimes they starve themselves. People with binge eating disorder don't compensate, and that's an important distinction. And as a result, they pay the consequence of the overeating and they gain weight, and most of them end up obese. Okay, so the line, to me, is one of the reasons I got interested in genetics. So there's something, and I saw this early on in my career in interviewing people, even when I was a resident in medicine. Something hardwired about a brain in people with anorexia nervosa that allows the body to starve itself sometimes to the point of death. That makes no sense teleologically. It makes no sense from a survival perspective. You could argue that binge eating in the face of restriction of calories makes a lot of sense. Because when you're in a semi-starved state, your brain is going to send out messages, hormonal messages, peptide messages to overeat. And so you could argue binge eating as a normal response to being starved. But it makes no sense that somebody could actually starve themselves to the point of death. And I've always felt there's something hardwired in the brain of people that allows anorexics to do this. If any of you have ever tried to lose weight and keep it off, it's damn hard. Right? Most people can't do that. You can lose weight, but the vast majority of people that lose weight regain it and usually overshoot what they used to be. And I am, to this day, amazed at the ease with which people with anorexia can lose weight and keep it off. It's remarkable. And it flies in the face of every biologic mechanism that we know that protects our bodies. Right? And so that got me interested in the genetics of anorexia, that observation. So let's go through the criteria. I'm not going to read each of the criteria. Suffice to say that binge eating disorder, as of last year, became the third eating disorder. It's the newest eating disorder. The important thing, again, it's characterized by recurrent episodes of binge eating. What's binge eating? Binge eating is not having an extra piece of pie. It's not having an extra piece of a main course. It's eating huge amounts of calories, usually more than a couple thousand calories in under an hour, and feeling out of control. So anybody watching somebody binge eat, it's grossly abnormal. Okay, so people say that I binge, but in reality, what they're reporting, they may feel out of control, but they're not actually consuming huge amounts of calories. When we talk about binge eating in the eating disorder world, thousands of calories in a very short period of time. And always felt accompanied by a feeling of loss of control. And the important thing with binge eating disorder, there's no compensation, and there's a frequency criteria. And it's not associated with anorexia or bulimia by definition. Okay? So it's the absence of compensation that defines binge eating disorder as different. There's a number of other differences that characterize it as different from anorexia and bulimia, and I'll mention that in a minute. So bulimia nervosa is binge eating with compensation, right? And because people compensate, they don't gain the kind of weight that people with binge eating disorder gain because they're not keeping their calories down. Vomiting is actually quite an efficient way of getting rid of calories. And people with bulimia can vomit 5-6 times a day. They can spend their entire day binging and vomiting in extreme cases. And again, huge amounts of calories in a short period of time. And just emphasizing that it's associated with recurrent inappropriate compensating behavior. differentiates binge eating disorder from bulimia nervosa. Anorexia nervosa, quite different. Okay, so the first thing about anorexia is that people restrict their energy to the point where they're underweight or emaciated and where it interferes with the person's well-being, physical and emotional well-being. So that's why anorexia is so much more dangerous than bulimia or binge eating disorder that don't have as high rates of mortality. You lower your body weight to a certain point, and you're also getting rid of essential electrolytes and nutrients. You're going to put your heart at risk. And mortality rate of anorexia now over long-term studies is between 10 and 15%. So 1 in 10 to 1 in 12 young women who develop anorexia are going to die, either by suicide or the medical complications of anorexia. And that's a sobering fact. It's actually one of the leading causes of death amongst adolescents, young adolescent women. So what's the epidemiology? What's the prevalence? And BED is the commonest eating disorder. It's more common than anorexia and bulimia, so the lifetime prevalence of BED amongst adults is between 3 and 4%, and 2% for bulimia, and a little less than 1% for anorexia. So overall, when you read in the newspaper that 20% of women have an eating disorder, it's just not true. Okay, what that reporter is saying is that people can have disordered eating. How many people in the room have had a cough? All of us. Does that mean you have lung cancer or pneumonia? No. So the behavior doesn't determine the syndrome. It really requires you to have the criteria that I've mentioned to you. So it's about 5% of adults have a serious eating disorder. That's the accurate figure. What's interesting about BED is the gender distribution. And what differentiates it from anorexia and bulimia is the fact that there's a much higher percentage of people with BED who are men. It's about 10% for anorexia and bulimia. It's about 30% for binge eating disorder. So we're not really sure why that is, but it is quite a remarkable difference in terms of the fact that men develop binge eating disorder at a much higher frequency than they develop anorexia or bulimia. And this slide simply shows your age of onset. So this is the age of onset of anorexia. You can see that basically it occurs in adolescence, early adulthood, and very few cases occur thereafter. New onset cases. Sure, I've seen them, you may have heard of them, but it's rare. Okay? If you pass the age of risk for anorexia, usually by the time you're in your early 20s, it's unlikely you're going to develop anorexia as you get older. That's not true for bulimia, which is in the blue, and certainly not true for binge eating disorder. So you can see that the age of onset of binge eating disorder continues to rise through your 20s and even into your 30s. Quite a different picture from an age of onset point of view. And binge eating disorder is associated with a lot of comorbidity. That means other kinds of psychiatric problems. So obesity, as I've said, the vast majority of people with binge eating disorder are obese. If they're not obese, they're overweight. I rarely have ever seen somebody with binge eating disorder that's a normal weight. If you think about it, it's counterintuitive. Because how could that be, right? They have high rates of mood disorders, that's affective disorders, primarily depression, anxiety disorders, and substance abuse. And interestingly, ADHD is quite common in people with BED. It's quite common in people who are obese. And there's a lot of reasons why that may be, and it has implications for treatment, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So this is the current clinical experience in North America. We just finished a study of binge eating disorder, and it's quite striking. So people with BED, if you go to the Toronto General Eating Disorder Program, you're going to get lots of people with bulimia referred and lots of people with anorexia. You'll get almost nobody who comes to the Toronto General Eating Disorder Program with binge eating disorder. Why is that? People with BED do not identify themselves necessarily as having an illness at all. So they don't even know they're ill. What they struggle with is their obesity. So they end up seeking treatment at weight loss programs, weight loss clinics. That's where you'll find people with BED, or bariatric surgery programs. Certainly not eating disorder programs that are associated with having a mental problem. And so for us to recruit subjects for this study, we had to advertise on the subway. That's the only way we could get people. And then we had a huge amount of response to that advertising. So they don't seek treatment in the typical eating sort of programs. When they do seek, it's usually for treatment, for weight loss, and I believe we as professionals have an important responsibility to really educate the public about this, because it's only a recently identified disorder, and people are not aware that there's help available. So what causes an eating disorder? What would you say causes an eating disorder? Just yell out what you think. Any eating disorder.
Trauma.
Sorry?
Trauma,
okay. Peer pressure. Genetics. Insecurity. All those are correct answers. If I asked you what causes cancer, what would the answer be? So the answer is the same, or heart disease. There isn't one cause for any illness, right? That's extremely simplistic. Most illnesses are multi-determined and have behind their etiology, or behind their cause, biological factors, psychological factors, and sociocultural factors. And it's especially true for people with eating disorders. And those factors usually impinge on an individual, usually in adolescence. So adolescence is one of the triggers. Why is that? Especially for anorexia and bulimia, because the body is changing. And what's the task of adolescence? The task of adolescence is to negotiate a separate sense of autonomy from your parents, develop your own self-identity, be able to negotiate a healthy sense of body awareness and sexuality, and come out the other end a reasonably adjusted adult. Okay? All of that whole process is very difficult for somebody who is at risk for anorexia nervosa. And I'll explain that in a minute. But at some point in adolescence, and I have a daughter who, when she was young, I used to hear her talking to her friends. Basically, adolescence hammers young women's self-esteem, even healthy. It's a difficult process. If you're vulnerable for other reasons, it's really going to send you down a pathway into an eating disorder. Because you're going to feel awful about yourself, you already have concerns about your sexuality and your body image and your self-esteem, and you will begin to restrict, thinking that if you lose weight, you'll feel better. Caloric restriction leads to binge eating. It's one of the most significant triggers for binge eating, and then you're just going to go back and restrict some more. So you get locked into a vicious cycle. And this is usually how we see people, and that's one of the reasons the treatment, first and foremost, especially for anorexia and bulimia, less so for BED, is regular intake of adequate calories. And one of the differentiations between BED and BN and AN is that BN and AN is characterized by high dietary restraint, so people restrain their eating, and the treatment is to lessen that restraint. People with binge eating disorder have low dietary restraint. They can't control themselves. And so the treatment for BED is quite different in the sense that you teach them some degree of dietary restraint, healthy dieting, if that's how you want to call it. So you can see the approach is quite different. So let's go through each of these factors. So genetics, I've spent really the last 20 years studying genetics. So it isn't that one gene causes an illness. That's not the kind of genetics we're talking about. We're talking about multi-determined genetics. And it ranges anywhere from something that's completely genetic. If you have the gene for Huntington's disease, it's one gene, you will get Huntington's disease. Doesn't matter what any of your other genes are like. It's one gene causes the illness. Same thing for cystic fibrosis. And then the other side of the spectrum are things about us that are totally non-genetic, have nothing to do with our genes. Religious affiliation. That has nothing to do with your genes. Most human characteristics are somewhere in the middle, and most diseases are somewhere in the middle. And they're partially inherited. And the inheritance comes from a multitude of different genes which are exhibiting different influences on your genome. So the question is always, the source of a family resemblance or difference. People can resemble themselves in a family because they share genes or they share an environment, or they can be different than, let's say, their sibling because they have non-shared environmental experiences. So what's a classic example related to your comment about trauma? Two twins in a family. They're 8 years old, two female twins, identical twins. They have the exact same genes. The parents take out one twin for dinner and leave the other twin behind with the neighbor's son's babysitter, who's babysitting, 15-year-old son, and he sexually abuses that twin. Okay, so that twin has had a unique experience. It's not shared in the environment with her co-twin. That puts her at risk to develop an eating disorder, whereas the other twin did not have that experience. So trauma does put people at risk for all kinds of disordered eating, and can lead to the development of an eating disorder in combination with other risk factors. So what is the heritability? What percent of the cause of eating disorders is genetic? It's highly genetic for anorexia nervosa. It's between 60 and 70%. So we couldn't say that, let's say, in 1995 when I started this research with a whole group of people across the world. There was little evidence that the genes played a role. We knew it was familial. That doesn't mean it's genetic, right? That doesn't tease out what I just talked about. Maybe it's familial because there's something in the family that's contributing. We now know that 70% of the cause of anorexia nervosa is genes. Okay, so that doesn't mean that if you have the genes, and there's multiple number of them, we've identified a number of those genes, you're going to get the illness. It puts you at risk, right? So if you have the BRCA gene for breast cancer, if you're a woman, that increases your risk for gynecologic cancers, breast cancer, dramatically. There are lots of women walking around with the BRCA gene who never get sick, never develop a malignancy. Why is that? So something has to trigger that in the environment. It's the same thing with eating disorders. You can carry the gene. We all walk around with risk factor genes, flawed genes in our genome. And most of us, hopefully, will never fall ill. And that's because our environment plays a role in triggering the genetic risk. And for binge eating disorder, it's less genetic, but it's still pretty high, between 50 and 60%, and that's the same for bulimia. And you can see here that the shared environment plays very little role, as in the case of anorexia. So that debunks the myth, which we used to talk about, which was not doing our patients or families a service by blaming the family. That does not hold up in research evidence. If there's some disturbance in the family, it's more likely a result of having a daughter who's starving herself than it is being a cause of that starvation. Okay, and that's really important. So all of this information, I believe, helps to destigmatize the illness for families so that they don't blame themselves. And it's really an important outgrowth of this research. The shared environment, sure, there's unique cases. I've seen cases where the family does play a significant role, but as a group, if you take group statistics, it plays very little role. And it's mostly genetic and the non-shared environment that contributes to risk. Psychologically, and I don't have time to go through this, but we know that people with eating disorders, before they're ill, let's say an 8-year-old girl, already has issues around her identity, her self-esteem, her autonomy, and her sexuality. The case I just described is an example of that. So these kids are at risk because they don't have a fundamentally secure sense of themselves. And you can identify early on that fact, which is why if you're going to prevent eating disorders, what happens if you go into a high school class and tell the girls not to throw up? What happens to the rates of vomiting? It goes up. Okay, so that's not the way you prevent eating disorders. You prevent eating disorders by talking to middle school kids, boys and girls, and you talk about self-respect and mutual caring and looking after yourself properly and proper nutrition. And so you will then help negate some of the risk factors that a little girl is carrying unknown to herself and probably her parents by doing something like that. And it's important to include the boys because they're a part of this problem. Boys become men. Let's talk about family, and this is important. So a family can either exacerbate the environmental influence, so we live in a punishing society, especially for women, or can provide a protective environment. So the classic example is if you have a strong family history of alcoholism, Why would you ever encourage your son or daughter to become a bartender? That's an unforgiving environment for somebody who's genetically at risk for alcoholism. It's the same thing for anorexia nervosa. There are certain things as a mother or father that you would not want to do if you know you have a risk for eating disorders in your family and a risk for substance abuse, which seems to run in the men, and depression and eating disorders in the women. My daughter was 5 years old. She came to me. She said she wanted to take dance lessons. I was very concerned about that, obviously. I took her to the National Ballet for a class. I was horrified. And again, whenever I tell this story, people start yelling at me, don't blame ballet. Okay, I'm not blaming ballet. It's not a forgiving environment. It just isn't. The walls in the room like this were covered with mirrors. All of the little kids were girls. The teacher was mean, and nobody smiled. Nobody was having a good time. I took her to a modern jazz class at the Y. It's completely opposite. No mirrors, little boys, little girls. The teacher was joking, the kids were laughing. Which class did I send my kid to? My daughter. But that's an example of being cognizant of forgiving environments versus unforgiving environments. And be aware of that. Know your child. So the things you should be careful about is anything that draws undue attention to a young girl related to weight and shape and self-esteem. Nothing wrong with gymnastics. Just make sure that your daughter has a solid sense of herself before she enters into a competitive athletic activity where you have to be thin. You're not going to do well as a gymnast if you're not thin. Dance, I already mentioned, modeling. The media is a big problem. So our media glorifies eating disorders. So everybody on this slide, and this is all public information, I'm not revealing any confidence, has self-declared having an eating disorder, and it's been confirmed. So, what's an example? Elton John has binge eating disorder. Oprah Winfrey's weight goes up and down like a yo-yo. She also is having binge eating disorder. James Fonda's book, if you ever read her autobiography, Chapter 8 is about her bulimia. And her entire exercise industry is all illness behavior. And she talks about that. She's also had alcohol problems. Michael Jackson's interesting. I was a visiting professor at UCLA in the early 1990s. This is after Thriller came out. He was a patient who weighed about 80 pounds. When he died from a propofol overdose, he was 92 pounds. It's not discussed in the media. The reason he died, it's not that the cardiologist gave him an overdose for a normal weight man. He gave him an overdose that killed him because he didn't take into account that he was emaciated, right? So what really killed him was his anorexia nervosa, not the propofol. And everybody else did. So we need to be aware of the fact that Hollywood is no friend of ours in this regard. And this is a good message. The Body Shop, we should all support the Body Shop. There are 3 billion women who don't look like supermodels and 8 who do, and those 8 are all photoshopped. They're not real people. Okay, Dove, the makers of cosmetics and soap, has a great website where they show you how pictures of women are photoshopped. And it really can make you sick when you see what we're exposed to. So how do you tease out the genetic from environmental factors? So here you have a ballet class, again, just as an example, guys. Here you have a genotype, an individual, AABB, capital. Here you have another genotype, small a, small b. One results in a prima ballerina for the National Ballet, and the other ends up acutely ill with anorexia nervosa. Okay? So how do we understand that interaction? Or binge eating disorder. Take-home message. Genes load your gun, and the environment pulls the trigger. Some of us have a loaded gun. We're all sitting here today. We're at risk genetically for certain diseases. Doesn't mean we'll get ill. But if a certain environmental trigger occurs, you will get ill. And the key is knowing what those triggers are. So I reviewed some of those with you tonight. You can't change your genes, but you can certainly do something with the environment. Okay, let's talk about treatment. I'll leave some time for Amy. So, talk about the psychological treatment of bulimia nervosa and binge eating disorder. Cognitive behavior therapy is the mainstay of treatment, and theory of cognitive behavior therapy is that we're dealing with behavioral symptoms at the surface, binging, dieting, vomiting. Underneath that are cognitive concerns about weight and shape, cognitive distortions about the way you think, and underneath all that are deficits in self-concept. You can't get an eating disorder if you have great self-esteem. Those two are incompatible. And I think Amy's comments refer to that. So how effective is psychological treatments for binge eating disorder? Bulimia? Very effective. These are good treatments, they work. Our problem in the field is we haven't disseminated them properly. So the average person who's on the front lines does not know how to do CBT. And so we have a problem in our field that we haven't properly trained and disseminated this knowledge. But if you get a 6-month course of CBT for bulimia or binge eating disorder, 70% of people will recover, which is terrific. It's remarkable, right? And will stay well. And the same thing with interpersonal therapy or dialectic behavior therapy. And even self-help has a significant remission rate. The important thing related to binge eating disorder, the psychological treatment doesn't do anything for weight loss. And so you're left with bulimia, a very happy person, because they don't need to lose weight, and they're not obsessed with that necessarily. But the obese person with bad is not happy, because what's driving them and upsets them is less the binging and more the obesity. So you're left with somebody who you've taken care of their binging, but they haven't lost a significant amount of weight. Probably over time they will if they stop binging, but it's going to take some time. So you have to address the obesity part. And CBT consists of 3 phases. The first has to do with behavioral monitoring of food intake, meal planning, self-monitoring, regular weighing. And there's a whole bunch of interventions that go along with reducing the behavioral component of the disorder. The manuals for this are available. They're online. You can download them. CBT for bulimia, CBT for BED. People in the field, Chris Fairburn, Marshall Marcus, many people have written about this. Easily accessible if you want to look at them. The second phase really focuses on the disturbed cognitions. You know, if I have a piece of pie, I'm going to gain 100 pounds. It's the kind of distortion that you hear from people. Everything is black and white. There's no gray. That's a typical way that a person with eating disorder thinks. We all live in the gray, right? And then relapse prevention is the third phase of CBT. And it's very similar for being in bed, with the one exception being the weight loss piece. You don't want to help a bulimic lose weight because there's no need for them to lose weight. Bed people need to lose weight because they're at medical risk related to their obesity. It's dangerous for them. Okay, if we had a drug, let's talk about drug treatments. So what are the goals of drug treatment for bed? Reduce the binge eating, maintain abstinence after the binge eating's gone, treat the comorbid problems, including obesity and facilitating weight loss. So the ideal drug would reduce binge eating and also lead to weight loss, right? And you have a very happy patient then. Treat the core disturbances in bed, which have to do with affect regulation, self-esteem, impulsivity, and the drug has to be safe and tolerable. So there's no point in a drug that people can't tolerate because of side effects. That's a useless drug. So this is the current status. I've summarized 10 years of research on this one slide. Some of it our group has done. There's no approved medication for bed in Canada. That changed in January this year where the FDA gave approval for Vyvanse, which is lisdexamfetamine. It's a psychostimulant which is used to treat ADHD. And I was involved in a study or two related to this, and it's a powerful drug. It really works, and works well. Now again, if you stop the drug, the person's not going to continue to benefit from the effects of the drug if they're not taking it. So that's another issue, but it has been approved for the treatment of binge eating disorder in the United States, not weight loss, even though it does induce weight loss. And that's partly the FDA's fear of all of the weight loss drugs that have been on the market have all been withdrawn because they all have caused cardiac toxicity and in some cases death. So they don't want to get involved in approving drugs for weight loss because of the risk. There's no evidence so far that that kind of toxicity applies to Vyvanse, but it remains to be seen. So the randomized trial are all small samples except for the Vyvanse, brief treatments. If you overall take all of the studies, about 45% of subjects receiving medication are going to achieve 100% remission. That's pretty good. half of the patients that you give a therapeutic dose to of an effective drug, in this case, let's say lisdexamfetamine, is going to, half of those people are going to be totally abstinent from binge eating. All of the obesity drugs have been withdrawn from the market because of cardiac complications. It doesn't appear to be much benefit of adding the drug to CBT, interestingly, other than the weight loss. But for the binge eating itself, CBT is as effective, if not more effective. There's no trials of maintenance therapy. So these are all short-term trials, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks. We don't know how long people need to be on these drugs. And so that's a deficit in the research. And psychostimulants, I think, are a promising area for research. Our group did a study, and just to cut to the chase, we did a study of long-acting methylphenidate. Methylphenidate is Ritalin. There's a long-acting compound, it's called Concerta. And if you look, we did an 8-week study, so people started at week 0 with a BMI of 36. That's 221 pounds. Okay? 8 weeks later, the weight was down to 188 pounds. That's a lot of weight loss in a short period of time. And look at their binge frequency. It went from 19 to about 1 per week. 3 per week, something like that. It's week 12, sorry, it's a 12-week study. And if you compare that to placebo, there's no comparison. People on placebo don't lose weight, and their binge frequency does not go down to the same extent. So it doesn't seem to be specific to Vyvanse or lisdexamfetamine. Probably any psychostimulant is going to have an effect like this. There's always a risk of tolerance on these drugs, and they have to be used carefully. But they do show promise because they're the only class of drugs that do both. Lead to weight loss and reduce binge eating. So for bulimia nervosa, the same kinds of goals, except weight loss. Right? For bulimia, you're not people losing weight. You want to reduce binge eating. You want to make sure they're abstinent. You want to treat the core disturbances and comorbid psychopathology, depression, anxiety, and it has to be tolerable and safe. So the same kinds of goals, and there's a lot of studies of bulimia that have been done over the last 20 years. That's actually 21 now, 21 randomized controlled trials. What you need to see, these are all different drugs. Yellow is drug, orange is placebo. Drug always does better than placebo for bulimia nervosa. So it's an adjunct to treatment, but the core treatment for bulimia, again, is CBT. That's the most effective treatment. And if you combine CBT with an SSRI, most of these are serotonergic reuptake inhibitors, you'll do better. Now we go to anorexia, and the story is unfortunately much less optimistic. So this is a quote from William Gold, and as was noted, anorexia has been around in the medical literature for 500 years. In fact, it was described in the Catholic nunnery in the 1400s. There's a book called Holy Anorexia that describes the evolution of anorexia in nuns in the Catholic Church. So it's been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. This is a quote from Gull, who was an internist in England, and he says, the treatment of anorexia is required, that is required is that which is fit for a person's unsound mind. He recognized that this was a mental illness, which in his day was an enormous advance. Like, nobody else had realized that. Patients should be fed at regular intervals, surrounded by persons who have moral control of them. Relations and friends being the worst attendants. I think he said that because what happens typically in families is the families get wrapped up in the illness and it destroys any chance of having a relationship. It's not always true, but that's what you often see in the acute phase. And usually leave the care to professionals, and the family should be supportive and not have to get involved in locking refrigerators and policing the child. And I do not at present prescribe medicine. The nursing and food are more important than anything else. This quote, you could change the date to 2015, would be absolutely accurate. And that's a pretty depressing statement. You know, in 2015, we have no evidence-based drugs for the treatment of anorexia, and we have no evidence-based psychological treatments for adults for anorexia. It's horrible. This is the kind of thing that makes me continue to work in the field, because it is an incredibly difficult illness to treat, and to understand. You're going to hear from Amy about some new studies that are beginning to look at the underlying brain abnormalities, which we know are there, which are we before had very difficult time identifying. So if you had a drug for anorexia, you would want it to promote weight gain, weight maintenance, treat the core disturbances. Again, anorexia always characterized by high anxiety, and again, be tolerable and safe, and that's especially important in somebody with anorexia because of the heart complications. So you can't be taking a drug that impacts the heart, and that's why we don't use tricyclics anymore, because they are associated with changes in heart rhythm, and theoretically are not safe to take with somebody who's underweight and already compromised. So this again is a sobering statement. There's no currently evidence-based drug treatments for acutely ill people with anorexia. We've been working now for 7-8 years investigating a different kind of drug. Some of you may have heard about it. So most of the studies, some of which our group did, looked at SSRIs, so Prozac, Luvox, Paxil. I'm sure you've heard of all of these drugs, Zoloft. They affect serotonin primarily in the brain, and it became clear to us that they were not going to be effective for the core symptoms of anorexia. So we started looking at drugs that affect other neurotransmitters, one of which is dopamine. Well, what does dopamine do? It tracks in the brain, but dopamine mediates cognition, which is why it's used in much higher doses for psychosis, because it's an antipsychotic. It modulates activity, so the classic illness of dopamine is Parkinson's disease. Right? That's what it is. It's depletion of dopamine in a certain area of the brain, and anorexia is a disorder of activity. So, curiously, studies have shown, and clinically you see this, people with anorexia, the more they run, the more energy they get, and they lose their appetite. That's not true for us or anybody else. The more I run, the more tired I get, and the hungrier I get. So there's something off in the regulation of activity in the brain that would allow an anorexic, as some of my patients do, to literally spend their entire day running around the city following trolley cars. I have a patient who does that. That's all she does. 12 hours a day at 54 pounds. Okay, so how does that occur? So you're dealing with some abnormality of the brain, and we think of dopamine, because dopamine seems to be implied or be involved in the core disturbances of anorexia. Third is anhedonia. People with anorexia don't get pleasure from the things that most of us find pleasure: food, sex, even drugs. So restricting anorexics have a lower rate of drug abuse than the general population. It's a very interesting finding. People with anorexia, restrictors especially, don't get the same euphoric effect from something like cocaine. How does cocaine work? It releases dopamine in the brain. Right? So if there's no dopamine to be released, they're not going to have any effect on somebody with anorexia. And mood. So it's typical for people with anorexia to be very dysphoric, have an irritable mood or an anxious mood, and dopamine regulates that. So that made us decide to look at a drug called olanzapine. We're still doing this study. This was the pilot study. We got a grant from the National Institute of Mental Health with my colleague in New York, Columbia. And the pilot study showed us that this was the 8-week study. So for those people who were randomized to the drug, they gained about 8 pounds in 8 weeks. That's a fair amount of weight gain in 2 months for somebody with anorexia. And people who were on the placebo gained 1 pound in 8 weeks. It's a dramatic difference. And we submitted this data, and the NIH then gave us $10 million to do a 5-site randomized controlled trial of this drug, the largest treatment study ever done in anorexia nervosa. We're in the 5th year of it. We've randomized 160. My research assistant is over there. Subjects across 5 sites, 4 in the United States, 1 in Toronto, and we're still taking subjects into the study. So if you know of anybody who'd be interested in this and have tried other things, we've proven beyond the shadow of a doubt that it's safe. There's no risk for people. We're using low doses. It's not the same as if you Googled it and you would see reams and reams of horrible side effects. Those are all reported in people with schizophrenia or bipolar illness taking 3 or 4 times the dose that we're using. And nobody has had any serious adverse effect. And people, once you explain this to them, seem to be willing to take it. So if you have anybody in your family or know of anybody who might be interested in this, we can give you information about it. And the study is going to close sometime in April. So we're still open for subjects. And the last new treatment we're going to talk about is RTMS. It's repetitive transmagnetic stimulation. So our group looked at a series of imaging studies, and the new age of neuroimaging, this is MRI. Have you ever had an MRI? It's painless. There's no radiation. You go into a machine. It, through magnetic waves, takes pictures of your body, different organs. And we can do that with the brain. And we found, when you look at all the data, that there's an area of the brain in people with anorexia, that's here, called the insula, that seems to be hyperactive. There seems to be too much neuronal activity. What does the insula do? It's very interesting. So it has a role and here's a cartoon picture of it, the insula. It modulates taste, feeding behavior, processing of interoceptive stimuli, that is body sensations, integrates feeling states, and self-awareness. All of these functions are abnormal in people with anorexia nervosa. Pain thresholds in people with anorexia are elevated. We've known that for decades. We never understood why that is. That's one of the functions of the insula, is to modulate body sensations. And so we felt that we have evidence that the insula is firing too much, to simplify matters, in the brains of people with anorexia. If we could set a magnetic stimulation, when you stimulate a nerve or a part of the brain, you reduce the firing. It goes into a refractory state. So we theoretically thought there was evidence that if we could deliver this in a totally safe way with no side effects through RTMS, maybe it would help people with anorexia. And we're in the middle of doing this study as well. And so basically, you sit in the chair, it looks like a dentist chair. You take this magnetic coil, you put it on your skull, and you sit there and read a newspaper or a magazine for half an hour, 40 minutes. You're done, you get up, and you go to work, you go to school, you go about your business. There's no side effects. Occasionally you might get a headache. You have to wear earplugs because it causes a noise in your ear. And we partnered with a physicist in Israel who developed a coil that targets the insula. So that's what's different about our study versus other people doing RTMS, because they don't have this special coil. So again, that's another study that's available if you know of anybody who might be interested in trying this out. And there really is no side effect to it. You're not taking a drug. We don't know if it's going to work. It's still too early to tell. But we have to think out of the box, right? We've got a disorder that's been around for hundreds of years. We don't have good treatments. We've got to try things that are different. That's really, I believe, what we have to do in this field, and not just follow the usual, if it works in depression, let's try it in anorexia. That has not worked for us in anorexia. We've got to do things that are different. So with that, I'm going to call up Amy, who's going to talk to you about, a cutting-edge study that we're doing, looking at brain circuitry in people with anorexia. So Amy Miles is my PhD student.
Hi. As you may have heard earlier, I originally had 4 slides, now I have 2. So bear with me if the flow is not quite as seamless as I had hoped. So my research is looking predominantly at brain anatomy in women with eating disorders, and as Alan alluded to, thanks to magnetic resonance imaging, or what we normally hear as MRI, we're able to examine brain anatomy in a painless, non-invasive way. So at an individual level, this can be particularly helpful for clinicians who are looking to identify major structural abnormalities in the brain. So for example, a tumor or a lesion. However, at a group level, this can help researchers identify subtler differences in brain structure that might not be evident on a single scan basis, because in the brain there's a huge amount of normal variation. So sometimes in order to appreciate more nuanced differences, you have to look at them over a larger group of people. So for example, when averaged across groups, women with a diagnosis of anorexia show significantly reduced total brain volume as compared to similarly aged women with no psychiatric history. So you might not see that looking at a single scan of a woman with anorexia, but across a number of them, you do see these differences that might be related to having had the illness, might be related to being currently underweight. That's sort of what we're in the process of teasing apart. Recent developments in MRI technology have made it possible to examine further subcomponents of brain anatomy in greater detail. So when you hear about brain anatomy, you often hear about either gray matter or white matter. Gray matter being sort of the cells of the brain, the structures where action is taking place. White matter, I find easiest to think of as the subway of the brain. It's the connective tissue that's linking those action-firing regions. So the advent of diffusion tensor imaging, which is a type of MRI, has made it possible to reconstruct these pathways by mapping the motion of water molecules in 3 dimensions. Without getting into the physics of it, in essence, if you think about going down a slide, if you pour water down a slide, it wants to move in the direction of that slide. So you're going to have a much harder time getting water to go across the slide instead of down the slide. So using that basic phenomena, we can try and identify where barriers in the brain are, because they would divert water away from that normal progression it would take down the slide. So these connective pathways are composed of fibers called axons, which are surrounded by a fatty substance called myelin. Myelin serves much the same purpose as insulation on an electrical cord. It conserves energy, and it increases the speed at which electrical impulses travel from one region of the brain to another. Because myelin appears white on dissection, so if you were to look at a slice of brain, the myelinated regions would look white, so that's been termed white matter of the brain. As I alluded to earlier, I like to think of white matter as the subway of the brain. Like the subway, white matter serves to rapidly connect different regions, and by doing so, it facilitates information flow. Again, like the subway, disruptions in service that limit or restrict access to one or more of these regions can wreak havoc. In the case of anorexia, structural impairments in white matter akin to subway tract deterioration can cause significant delays in information processing. So to date, several studies in anorexic women have revealed these types of disruptions along fibers connecting portions of the brain involved in processing body signals, so one of those being the insula, in recognizing and responding to emotions, and in planning and decision making. So if you look at the graphic on the right, this depicts the major fiber tracts of the brain as reconstructed using diffusion tensor imaging. And you'll notice that there are colors. The colors aren't actually in your brain, unfortunately, but represent direction of fibers. So some going straight up and down, some going side to side, and then some moving, if you think about it, diagonally across a 3-dimensional space. So disruptions along these fibers, and in particular along a handful of those that we've identified, seem to relate to patterns of altered behavior seen in women with anorexia. So for example, there's a fiber bundle called the cingulum, which sort of runs along the center of the brain on each side and connects various parts of the sort of limbic part of your brain, or emotional, impulsive, affective part of your brain, to more frontal regions, which are involved in things like decision making and behavioral control. So we've seen that along this bundle, changes in the structural integrity seem to predict levels of dysfunction, for example, levels of anxiety in women with eating disorders, or level of risk avoidance or harm avoidance. So there seems to be some direct relationship between the actual structure of the fiber and the way that the disorder is manifesting. Of course, the question then becomes, do these disruptions occur as a direct result of malnutrition, or are they just because people who are not eating are losing weight and they're losing fat cells, which is precisely what makes up this sort of insulating sheath around the fibers? Or do these disruptions actually evolve during childhood and early adolescence because of some sort of genetic wiring that is then, acted upon or otherwise exacerbated with the onset of adolescence and the additional effects of acute malnutrition. So, this is my very cute graphic. In order to begin answering this question, Dr. Kaplan and I are running a study at CAMH, and just to clarify, it's the College Street site, for which we are seeking to recruit participants. The study involves answering a series of questionnaires and sitting for a 25-minute MRI scan, all of which can be accomplished in 2 hours across 1 or 2 sessions. In order to tease apart the effects of genetic vulnerability and acute malnutrition, we're recruiting women aged 18 to 48. And in particular, we're looking for sister pairs in which one sister has a current or past diagnosis of anorexia and the other does not. The reason we're particularly interested in this group is that siblings share a percentage of their DNA. So by looking at those brains, we can try and say, what percent of variation that we're seeing when comparing these two might be attributable to the fact that they have similar genetics versus what might be attributable to unique environmental experiences like being the one twin that was left home with the babysitter versus what might actually just reflect a history of having had the disease and not quite being able to fully recover from the stress on the brain. So as you can see, it's pretty general inclusion criteria. I did give Wendy a handful of flyers that have some more information. But if you've been diagnosed with anorexia, if you have a sister or a daughter who's been diagnosed with anorexia, I certainly hope that you'll reach out. There's phone and email information. And also, if you're comfortable, I will also be staying after with Alan to discuss any questions you might have, really. I know that was a fairly superficial overview of white matter, and I'll talk your ear off about it if you want. So just let me know. But thank you for bearing with me with my 2 slides, and I think we're going to take questions.
Well, so Amy and I are available for any questions you might have. Yes?
I was informed about, through the David Suzuki Nature of Things programs that there's a study going on in Brisbane, Australia, about sound and how sound is affecting the brain. And I wondered whether there were any other research studies that were working with them. So because it seems that I'm not quite sure how it works because I don't know what the actual...
You're talking about for anorexia nervosa or eating disorders, or just in general?
Well, I'm talking in general, but because we're talking about how it can affect tumors and how it can affect, we're talking about those 2 areas here, right, in the translation, whether there's anything that's being focused on with just sound, with MRIs. And
yeah, I'm not, certainly in the area of eating, so I'm not aware of anybody that's specifically looked at sound. There's no evidence to suggest that sound perception per se is abnormal in people with anorexia bulimia. But I don't know if you know of anything in general. I'm sure people have looked at the impact of sound under an MRI scan just to see which parts of the brain light up,
right,
as opposed to other parts that don't. We know the tract for sound in the brain. I'm not sure how that would relate to eating disorders or even new treatments, but...
I don't know either. I just wondered whether there was anything.
Yes?
What is the point of using olanzapine if all you're seeing is weight gain and there's no change in muscle matter?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and the answer is it's not all we're seeing. In fact, what we see is a pretty significant effect on all of those areas that I mentioned in terms of functioning. More stable mood, less obsession with weight and shape, less drive to exercise, less aberrant salience. What do I mean by that? So people with anorexia have abnormal interpretation of their bodily sensations. So I may have lunch and feel full. Someone with anorexia will have lunch and feel fat. That's a big difference, Because my feeling full, I'm not going to act on that. I'm just going to know that it goes away. Somebody who misinterprets the sensation in their gut as fatness is then going to go to the bathroom and throw up. Okay, and that is all mediated through dopaminergic pathways. And we, from the experience I've had, I'm still blind to who gets placebo, who gets drug, although after 5 years, I would say I could pretty much guess. But people report that their taste has gotten better. They enjoy things they never enjoyed before, including eating. They're less disturbed by eating, and whatever weight gain occurs is therapeutic in the sense that people are not as disturbed by it as they would previously, right? So it has quite a broad effect, not just weight gain. And the weight gain isn't a side effect, and that's really important because this drug does cause weight gain at higher doses, which is a side effect. And having been in this field with 35 years, I would never give a drug to somebody with anorexia and expect them to take it if a side effect is weight gain. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? They're not going to take it. But if you explain to people that at the dose we're using, if they gain weight, it's a small amount and it's therapeutic. In other words, they say, well, I don't mind the weight gain. I feel stronger, I feel healthier, I'm sleeping better. So it's an overall improvement in their clinical state that occurs associated with a relatively small amount of weight gain for most people. It can exacerbate binge eating, which we've seen, but for most people that doesn't occur at the doses we're using. So everything is dose dependent, right? The big difference if you take 2 Tylenol as opposed to taking 20 Tylenol. 20 Tylenol will kill you. It'll wreck your liver. 2 Tylenol will take your headache away. So you got to take that into consideration when you're looking at any drug. Olanzapine's gotten a bad rap. I'm very well aware of that. But again, it's because people don't understand the dose-dependent differences, and when it's been used, it's not been used properly.
Have you been able to see any differences between the subtypes of anorexia?
That's a great question. We haven't yet analyzed the data for the big study, and that's one of the things we're going to look at. Do people with restricting form of anorexia do better than those with the subtype of binging? Because, you know, has this drug actually increased binging? We don't know the answer to that. It's a great question, and it's an important thing that we'll look at. Yes?
There's been a lot in the media recently, and we were at a conference, a leader conference, where they spoke about the gut and the microbiomes in the gut. And I wonder if you could comment on it, the way they affect everything, and they're looking at how it affects BED and other EDs.
Yeah, I think it's an important new area. Previously, I don't think in medicine generally we paid a lot of attention to the fact that our gut is full of bacteria. Bacteria actually help keep us in an internal homeostatic balance. And if you disrupt that bacteria, the most common way that occurs is with antibiotics, you can get very ill. And so people are now looking at the effect of the microbiome on anorexia, especially knowing that people with anorexia change their microbiome by their behaviors. Vomiting, certainly laxatives. People taking laxatives wipe out the normal microbiome, and what takes over could play a role in why the illness is so hard to treat at that point. So it's a new area, and it's an interesting area, exciting area. We're not doing research on that, but I'm certainly aware of it.
Would you ever start I know your focus now, thank goodness, is on anorexia. Would you be doing the brain stimulation studies on people with BED as well? Because I think there may be some kind of different kinds of disruption there.
Yeah, I personally wouldn't be doing that. There are good treatments for BED. And so I would say, well, why don't you try the good treatments first? Most people with BED, if they get proper psychological treatment or medication, are going to do really well. That's not true for anorexia. Are there people using RTMS for bed? I suspect there are. I've not seen any published reports on it, but RTMS is a hot new area. It's being applied across the board for a lot of disorders, not just in psychiatry. So I suspect people are looking at it. Yeah.
In an earlier slide of yours, you mentioned ADHD. I'm not sure if it was specifically regarding males, but can you just comment briefly on the cause and effect relationship? Is bed triggered by ADHD, or does that cause an unmasking of that symptomology?
Yes, that's a great question, and I didn't have time to go into it. But basically, ADHD has been found to be associated with low levels of dopamine in the brain. And so psychostimulants increase dopamine. That's how they work. It affects the cognitive mediation by dopamine of the way you focus and attend. It's thought, and we know that people who have ADHD as children have a much greater prevalence of becoming obese as adults. And how do we understand that? So there are some who believe that people with low dopamine who are at risk for ADHD are going to use food to bump up their dopamine, because food increases dopamine, and as a result of that are going to gain weight and become obese. So that's the thinking behind it. And binge eating disorder is and binge eating is another way of bumping up your dopamine relatively quickly. You get a huge rush of dopamine after a binge, which is why people feel much more relaxed. Some people even go to sleep. It has an anxiolytic effect and a sedative effect when you eat a huge amount of food. So there is an association. The underlying theory, and we don't know for sure, but it's a theory, is that it's all mediated by dopaminergic dysfunction in the brain. And it's the same reason why people will turn to alcohol or drugs like cocaine, all in an attempt to increase dopamine levels.
So therefore, CBT or any form of therapeutic intervention probably would be less likely to succeed. It would be more of a pharmacological solution?
Yes, so we know psychotherapy changes brain chemistry. That's been proven. You can do MRI scans on people before, let's say CBT, and after, and the brain function changes. So it's not so simple. And that's an important thing to understand. So it's not either or. Psychological treatment can improve brain function. Medication can improve brain function. The two together might improve brain function in more than an additive way.
Thank you.
But great question. Yeah.
A couple quick questions, and I'm sorry I wasn't here at the beginning, so we may have covered it. But a lot of the work that you're doing, a lot of the stats that have been presented are dealing with the female population. And I read 4 years ago now that of the anorexic population, we're looking at anywhere from 25 to 35% being male.
Okay, that's not correct.
Okay.
So it's 10%. At most, 10% of people with anorexia are male. 30% of bed patients are male. So that's for sure.
So then, even with that 10%, if you're looking for siblings, would it just be in the female population, the 18 to 48?
Yeah, I'll let Amy explain why we're focusing on females.
So for sort of the purposes of maintaining statistical power, it's very important to limit the number of potential confounds you have. One of which is that men and women have different sized brains. And sort of contrary to popular opinion, that doesn't mean anyone is smarter or less smart than the other. It just means their sheer size difference. But when we do the actual analyses, it can be very difficult to account for that size difference in a way that preserves the anatomy that we are looking at. So for now, we are keeping it just to sisters in order to limit that statistical confound. But hopefully, once the pilot data is in and we have something to go off of, we would be able to recruit a much larger sample, which would include brothers and potentially men with anorexia, because I think that's an important group to look at as well. The reason it's limited as of now is just for numbers, and hopefully over time we'll be able to expand that pretty precipitously.
Yes, so much of what we get, the information from MRI studies, DTI studies, has to do with brain volume, brain space. So it's very different in men and women because of the size. That's basically the answer. But again, it's a great question. There's no reason to exclude men. They're as important and their illness is as serious as in women. But, we wouldn't have enough men to look at them separately in cohort because it's so rare in men. That's what we have to do.
was just interested in your mention of Parkinson's disease. Because my daughter with her anorexia bulimia has a grandfather who has Parkinson's disease. Is this common kind of genetic link?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any genetic link. It's a completely different part of the brain that is affected by Parkinson's disease than the part of the brain that we're talking about. So even though it's dopamine, but dopamine occurs throughout the brain. And in Parkinson's, it's the area of the brain called the substantia nigra, which is very far away from the area that we're looking at. I'm not aware of a genetic link between Parkinson's and anorexia. Doesn't mean there isn't, but I'm not aware of it. Yes?
What are the differences between the way RTMS works as compared to the deep brain stimulation?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. Deep brain stimulation, first of all, is much more invasive. It's neurosurgery. The neurosurgeon puts a hole in your skull and inserts a wire. And you would not be able to get a wire deep enough into the insula. Okay, so they're going for the area of the brain that was established to be mediating depression. It's area 25. Because it's relatively easily accessible once you get into the brain and the surgeon's putting the wire through. So just in terms of neuroanatomical functioning, you would want to go where the action seems to be for anorexia. It's in a number of areas, but certainly the insula is a prominent one. And it's, as far as I'm aware, there's nobody doing DBS putting a wire into the insula. It's just technically very difficult to do.
Is it possible to do both DBS as well as RTMS?
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to do that because the RTMS would affect the wire functioning, right? You could do RTMS first, and if that doesn't work, do DBS. But again, I think a lot of this has to do with consumer receptivity. So how many of you are willing to have a neurosurgeon put a hole in your skull and sort of wire it that's permanent, right? That's very different than going and sitting in a chair and having a magnetic wave applied to your brain and then you get up and you leave, right? There's no side effects. So I'm not saying DBS as a last resort should be considered for seriously ill people, but for the general population of people with anorexia, for most people it's not an acceptable option. And it's not available. RTMS is much more available. But they do the same thing at the end of the day. The wire is a stimulator, right? It's local stimulation. The RTMS creates a magnetic field that causes electrical stimulation in the brain. So the theory behind it is simple. And to take it to an extreme, electroconvulsive therapy is electrical stimulation of the entire brain, right? Which is why it's fraught with all kinds of bad side effects, memory loss, let's say. But it's the same idea behind it, is that stimulating the brain is therapeutic. Yeah.
You said that you're accepting people until April?
For the drug study.
For the drug study. How long after that period would you be able to provide information, like when would the results of the study be?
Yeah, so generally speaking, when you finish a study like that, this is a big study. It's a huge amount of data. Data is in a database at Columbia University. So you would break the blind and you start analyzing the data. That process takes anywhere between 6 months and a year to be able to answer the specific, and there's many analyses that you would run, one of which somebody mentioned, looking at the difference response according to the subtype. There's a whole bunch of other different analyses you'd want to run. But, you know, I would say by the time we would be able to publish the results, you're talking probably about a year. That's part of the problem with research, is there's a lag time.
And one other question. You were talking about for binge eating disorders that cognitive behavior therapy is probably one of the best treatments. Why do you think people are not being trained properly, and how can we as NIED improve that? Because basically, I mean, if it works and it's 70%, I mean, there's so many people, it would be wonderful to be able to
Absolutely.
positively impact
Yeah,
so many more
we professional community should work with you in, first of all, educating people that there are psychological treatments that are effective, they're available. You know, the biggest problem is that the frontline clinician group has not been trained to deliver these treatments. There is special training required.
Right.
Increasingly, the Academy for Eating Disorders, Eating Disorder Research Society, other NIED in the United States, I mean, they are providing training sessions for clinicians, and it is starting to get out there, but not to the extent we'd like to see it. So you could play a role by educating the public to become aware of the fact that there are effective psychological treatments and to ask for those treatments by their caregivers. And if the caregiver doesn't know how to deliver it, to get a referral to someone who does. Most of these are delivered by PhD level or master's level psychologists. Yeah?
I'm a registered psychotherapist, and I know I'm Gestalt trained, which is holistic, emotion focused, and that also has been, although we don't have the results, we don't have the CBT types of results yet, but that also gets good responses, as does the self-help, those who stick with it.
Yeah, I mean, that's informative. The data I always present is evidence-based.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I'm sure many different kinds of therapies help people, but you need the evidence to demonstrate that and to be able to say to somebody, you should get this treatment because we know it's going to be effective for you 70% of the time. Yeah?
This goes to the schools. What is it they say for the new school curriculum? What do they say and at what grade do they introduce the body image and how to be aware? And are the teachers aware? And if a teacher is aware, where do they go with the information?
It's a great question. I wish I could answer it. The person who could is somebody called Gail McVeigh. She runs the school intervention program. She's based at Sick Kids. She's done a lot of work in this area. So you probably could find her if you Google her, MCVEY. And I think she has data to give you on that. But I know the previous programs that went into schools, which were in the high schools, have been stopped because they are not helpful and sometimes they're harmful. So a lot of these school curricular changes have been implemented in middle school, not high school. But I can't give you any more information on that. Maybe somebody else knows. Anybody a school teacher here? Or? Yeah.
How many sessions of RTMS do you normally give?
Right, so in our study, we're giving it 4 times a week. So people come in at 8 in the morning, and they can leave usually by 9, and we do it for 4 to 6 weeks. And then we check for response, and some people have a dramatic response, especially for mood, and some people need booster sessions. So I have 2 physicians now who got it for depression, and they're functioning. One's a surgeon. But if this person goes more than 4 weeks without a booster session, she starts to slip. And it's quite dramatic to see. She notices it. So she just goes in and gets a booster treatment for 20 minutes or half an hour once a month. And it holds her, maintains her.
Does the machine go, I know because Amy had this a few years ago, when it first started. Does the machine still go on one side and then one side, or is it?
It depends on what magnet you're using. And so there's many different kinds of magnets. Our magnet, we're looking at primarily doing it in the frontal part of the brain, and it's like a helmet that you wear. It looks like a bicycle helmet. And if you don't get a response in one area, you might try another area, right? Because it's not exact in that sense. And it's difficult with anorexia because there's a big space between where the brain ends and the skull begins. And so all of the parameters that you get from the makers of these magnets are for normal brains, or at least brains that aren't wasted. People with anorexia, the brain is shrunk. So it makes a big difference because of that distance in the parameters of where you put the magnet. So that's an issue we've had to deal with. Yes?
I don't want to hazard a guess at the percentage, but I suspect that there's a a large number that present with anorexia that are also dealing with something else concurrently, whether it be bipolar disorder, depression, addiction of one form or another. That it's probably fairly rare that it stands alone. So when you're doing your studies, how do you deal with your subject matters in regards to, first of all, who's able to join the study, what comes first, the treatment of addressing the addiction or the other disorder? Or
again, terrific question. So one of the problems with research in the past is that it's been too pure in who, what kind of patient are led into studies that are not representative of the kind of people that walk into your office. You're absolutely right. Comorbidity is the rule rather than the exception in people with anorexia. Almost everybody with anorexia has a concomitant anxiety problem, mood problem, more rare substance use. In the drug study, we are taking all comers because we want to reflect reality, something that could generalize to the average clinician who sees people with anorexia, unless it puts the person at risk. So, for example, we can't take people that are actively abusing alcohol because the RTMS, or the drug and the RTMS actually lower the seizure threshold, and so does alcohol. Right? So we can't take the risk of somebody who has a seizure. But other than that, they can be on medication. They can be getting other kinds of treatment. We have people, in the olanzapine trial, one of the things that was dramatically affected was anxiety levels, which dropped as a result, and obsessionality as a result in the pilot study, as a result of the drug. And that's been reported by others as well. So, we're moving away from research trials that don't reflect reality because they're not that helpful to the general clinician.
Are there any other questions?
I'm getting.
Yes.
Is there a certain BMI level where it's not safe to do the olanzapine study or the RTMS?
Yes. So you have to have a BMI above 14. It's arbitrary, but that's below that level you start to get into all kinds of medical problems, and again, the seizure threshold lowers. So we've established 14 as the cutoff. And I think that's the same for the imaging study. People with a BMI under 14 usually are advanced. They're medically unstable.
People online are also asking if the research is for adults or adolescents or both. Is there an age?
This is all adults.
All adults. Okay.
18 years and older.
Okay.
None of this research we're using, I don't see adolescents. It's only for adults.
Okay.
And I think that's true for your imaging.
Well, the brain develops in sort of these critical periods, and the trajectory is different in adolescents than it is in adults. So for sort of the sake of preserving the developmentally appropriate trajectory, we're just looking at adults. People are looking at adolescents separately, but then you're dealing with massive changes in brain anatomy that have to do solely with normal development and may or may not reflect disease state at all.
Yeah, an adolescent's brain is not fully formed.
Mm-hmm.
It's still developing. So you can't really draw much in the way of conclusions about it.
How long does it take for a brain of an anorexic to shrink, or you can actually notice it? Like, is it over a period of 1 year, 3 years?
It's a good question. The study, you can comment too. The studies that I know of vary, but it's more quickly than you would think. So 6 months into an anorexic state, you start to see changes. Even sooner when you're just looking at fluid levels. So remember, 40% of our body weight is fluid. And people with anorexia lose fluid. They become quite dry and dehydrated. The white matter begins to break down. And so again, the white matter, the analogy, you can use the subway, or you can use this. So picture this as the neurocircuitry. The rubber is the myelin that wraps around the neurocircuitry, right? If we broke the plastic and cut some of the wire, the electrical impulse would stop, right? And myelin is 100% lipid, it's fat. So when a body starts to lose fat, it loses fat from the entire body, every organ, including your brain. So you start to see myelin breakdown pretty early on, once a person's level of body fat goes below a certain point. And if that continues, it's going to disrupt neurotransmission, transmission of the electrical impulse from one area of the brain to the other area of the brain.
Which of course feeds on itself and makes it worse. So.
Yeah, and we know that anorexia is really a neuropsychiatric illness. There's cognitive deficits. It's not the same as Alzheimer's, but the brain of an anorexic in some ways looks not that different from somebody with dementia. And the thinking of people with anorexia is abnormal. They can't process higher level functions the same way that somebody who doesn't have anorexia. And some of that has to do with the disruption of the circuitry from one part of the brain to the next, especially the tract that Amy was talking about.
Does brain recover?
That's the million-dollar question. Okay, so one of the reasons Amy's doing this study is to answer that question. In terms of gray matter, there's some evidence that there's recovery, but other studies have shown not full recovery. And there might be permanent damage. So it's the critical question. And even if there's recovery, is there a scar? Right? So you could break your leg, and over time your leg will heal, but you'll have a scar there from the surgery. And your gait may not be 100% normal, especially if it wasn't set properly. So we believe that there is the possibility of scarring in a brain that has gone through that level of depletion in terms of its mass and then recovers. That even if it recovers in terms of volume, it doesn't function normally because of some kind of scarring in terms of the neurocircuitry. But we'll be able to answer that question because Amy didn't mention, we're looking at people who are underweight and also people that are weight recovered. And we're going to compare to see whether the people that are weight recovered are fully recovered. We're doing neuropsych testing on everybody to see whether their psychological functioning, their cognitive functioning is normal or not. And that's an unanswered question. So that's why this study is so important. We're going to be able to correlate the anatomical abnormalities with functional abnormalities in people that are underweight, weight recovered, and most importantly, the sieves, healthy sieves of sisters who have had anorexia. Because that gets to the genetic question, which we've never been able to answer fully. If we find the same abnormality in a healthy sister as we do in a weight-recovered anorexic co-sister, that's of dramatic importance because it proves that the genetic risk actually manifests itself in white matter functioning. And that has tremendous implications. And puts the sister probably at some level of risk for some kind of problem. So that's why and it's not easy to find somebody who's ill or has been ill and has a sister who's healthy. So part of us coming here is to put our salesman's hat on and ask you for help in recruiting somebody like that.
We have two daughters. One is 16, one is 19. That's too young, correct?
16. The 16-year-old is too young. But, hopefully, I don't know which one is ill.
The 19.
Yeah, so hopefully the 16-year-old will go through the rest of her adolescence and be healthy. And yeah, we would be very interested. And they may be too interested in knowing what's going on in the brain. We can't provide people with a picture of their MRI scan. And they have to take that and get it interpreted clinically by a radiologist or their family doctor. So there is some information that someone's going to walk away with this study that's very, very important and I think valuable.
Participants need to live in Toronto?
No. For the brain study, not at all. Okay. You can live anywhere you want to live as long as you're willing to come into Toronto once. Amy could do this probably
2 hours
on one visit or maybe 2 days consecutively. So anybody who's interested, again, we can provide you with the information, but they can live wherever.
And we do reimburse $50 for participation, so that can certainly help offset some travel costs for people.
we provide a $250 amount of money for the olanzapine trial just to pay for people's TTC or out-of-pocket expenses coming down to CAMH. That they would have to live within a reasonable distance because they'd have to come every week for 16 weeks. So the same thing with the RTMS. So it wouldn't be practical if somebody lived a distance away to participate in the treatment studies. Well, I guess our time is running out, so thank you for listening.
Dr. Kaplan, maybe don't go anywhere yet. My name is Lord Bernson. I'm a member of the synagogue. And some years ago, my wife and I were fortunate enough to endow a program here at Temple Sinai. It's entitled Kedushat Aguf, which literally translated means sanctity of the body. The intention behind the endowment was to provide a safe space to discuss some very difficult topics. We know these topics for many people and for many families, ours included. Can't just be sheltered under your roof. We need the opportunity to be together and to discuss and be informed and be better educated. And for that, Dr. Kaplan, Amy, thank you for what you presented this evening. I know it's been extremely helpful. I'm sorry I was late. I was at another meeting. I got here as soon as I can. To everybody that's working so hard at NIED, just keep up the great work. We all have to work together to move things forward as quickly as we can, as efficiently as we can, with our voices and whatever other energies that we have. On a personal note, Dr. Kaplan, you and I have not met. Some 16 years ago, you saved your daughter's life. I want to say this evening, thank you for that. She presented with all the concurrencies, I don't know if that's the right medical term, that one could present, from weighing 80 plus pounds to drug addicted and depressed. And she's really doing well today. Terrific. Thank you.
On behalf of NIED, I'm one of the steering committee members, and I would like to thank Amy and Dr. Kaplan for coming. For me personally, it really helps. I've been in this from the beginning with Wendy, and it helps every time I hear you put it into lay terms.